All right, as I said, my name's JT. Tonight we're going to talk about AngularJS. This is not really a Perl topic. It's all JavaScript, but I am going to cover it from the point of view of Perl a little bit. I'll do some compare and contrast here and there, as well as some tips and tricks that'll help you integrate AngularJS with your existing applications, should you have them. Because it's one thing to build an AngularJS app right out of the gate for a new backend. You can design everything to be perfect, but if you're going to develop it against an existing backend, you may already have certain services formatted a certain way or things like that that'll make it a little trickier to deal with Angular. So I'll cover a few things like that. Again, no formality, so feel free to shout out questions if you have them along the way. So first we should talk about what is Angular. Angular is a framework built by Google to help people build web apps, front-end web apps, quickly, easily. The easiest way to describe it is that it is an extension of the vocabulary of HTML. So it allows you to literally define your own new HTML tags and what those, what meaning those things have, what functions they perform. Does it connect back to a server? Does it have some sort of animation associated with it? Whatever it is. You can define your own HTML tags, which is pretty amazing. You're basically extending the functionality of the browser with this. And if you learn this and you do it well, I kid you not, it will change the way you do development permanently. Because it is so much cooler than any other framework that's out there because of how it works. And you'll see that as we go along. I don't want to try and get into it yet because you won't get it until you see it. But at the end we can talk a little bit about, like, did it just blow your mind? Before we do this though, I would like to just get a show of hands. Who here has heard of Angular before now? Looks like everybody, okay. Who here has actually coded anything in Angular? So we've got about a third of the room, a little bit. Okay. Some iffy people. That's okay. Cool. If I skip ahead of something that, so it doesn't make sense for all of you that haven't done this before, feel free. Again, shout it out. We'll work through it. So there are lots of components in Angular. Tonight we're going to cover these. There's modules, which are basically the same thing as a package in Perl. It's just a way to collect a bunch of code together so that you can use it. There are controllers, which is kind of like your main in Perl, or it's basically, well, if you're familiar with model view controller, then it is a controller in that sense. But if you're not familiar with it, think of it as this is where you're going to fire off your basic stuff. There isn't going to be a whole lot of actual application logic there, other than just here's what the things are, and we're going to call other pieces. Filters basically format content for display purposes, so you can have content that is, maybe it is an floating point number and you want it rounded to a specific decimal place. A filter could do that, or a date could be formatted as something, or a color could actually become a color rather than the word blue or something like that. Lots of things like that. That was a filter. Formatters allow you to do that same thing, except at the low level of your model, of your data model. So you can actually convert the data as it's coming in and out of the system with a formatter. Directives allow you to define your own custom tags, and that's where the real power of Angular is. In fact, in Angular 2.0, right now Angular 1.3 is out. They're working on 1.4, and there's going to be a 1.5. But beyond that, they're probably going to switch to 2.0. And the idea is that controllers will go away entirely, and you'll build everything in directives. So directives will become the powerhouse, which really they already are for most things. Then there's services and factories, which are two sides of the same coin, basically. That's where most of your application logic is going to reside, is in there. There's plenty of other things. We're not going to really cover them, or if we do, they're going to be in brief, so not bringing them up. So let's start with modules. This is, to start any application, you have to create a module. So in this case, I'm creating a module called madmongers, and that again is similar to package in Perl. If I were to add in some other module inside the braces there, then that would be the same as use other module in Perl. So you're basically loading in other modules. I should point out, this does not mean you're actually loading an external JavaScript file. You have to already have loaded that before you can use that module. So if you do have, if you have your modules out in some other JS file, you need to use a script tag to bring that in, or one of the other module handler systems, and then you can tell Angular you want to use it with the some other module in braces or brackets like that. Then from there, usually the next step people do is create a controller, because it's really, really simple to do. And it's really simple to see its power almost immediately. So in this case, I have created a controller called test controller, or test CTRL. And I should say that it's best practice to end your controllers with CTRL. There's some magic that happens inside of Angular, and you can take advantage of some of that if you name your stuff the appropriate way. We'll get into the magic way later, but anyway. And then I'm going to bring in a special variable. There are a bunch of global variables that you can, well, they're not global, but you have to bring them into everything that you want to use. Scope is one such variable. The HTTP is another one. There's all kinds of different variables like that that you can bring into any of the different components that you're working on. So by specifying it there, I'm able to pull it in. The scope is basically a special variable allowing me to export things from the controller to a view, so that in the view, in HTML, I can render it. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to assign my name to that. You can assign anything you want. You can create an object and assign that there. So you can do all kinds of stuff. But for this one, I'm just going to have a single variable attached to the scope called name, and it will contain JT by default. Pretty straightforward, right? So
when does that function get executed?
That function will get executed immediately upon loading the page.
Okay.
So this is just straight JavaScript at this point. It's just being executed as is. I haven't created a function that I can call later, and I will do that, but that's not what we're doing so far. So this is the controller. Now, in any kind of model view controller paradigm, you have the scope is going to be your model essentially, right? It's your data that we're exporting, and you have to also have a view, and the view is going to be your HTML. Yeah.
So it might be helpful to point out for people who are familiar with Perl but not JavaScript that $sign before scope is part of the name and it's not a sigil.
Oh yes,
yeah.
That is a good point. Yes, I'm sorry, I should have pointed that out.
What's the reason they do that?
So the $sign indicates that this is something generated by Angular, so that you have. It's just the same reason that like jQuery has a $sign.
Right.
So this is this is an Angular created variable.
Okay.
So that way you know it's separate from something else that you might create. So that's that. Anyway, so creating a controller is basically just, or I'm sorry, a view is just basically creating some HTML with some special stuff in it. So in any given tag, it doesn't have to be a div tag, ng app madmongers says that we are going to bind our Angular app called madmongers that we defined in the previous page to this tag and anything inside of it. Okay, so our app is functioning in this part of the DOM. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Then we also have to define where the controller is going to attach. In this case, I want it in the same section. But I could make it down further, inside of madmongers, anywhere down there. So I could have put ng controller test control down on the next div down if I wanted to. But in this case, I want it to envelope the entire app. There's only one controller, so that's what we're doing. And then ng model allows us to bind specific scope variables to specific form controls. So it allows us to have a bidirectional communication with those two things. If I update in code, if I update scope.name, it will automatically update the form control, and vice versa. If you update the form control, it'll automatically update scope.name because of this binding. Does that make sense? Okay. Um, and then finally, double brace is the syntax for a template variable in Angular. So in this case, I'm getting access to the name scope variable, and I will just be outputting it there. And of course, template variables are one way, so they're going to output something. Any questions on any of that? If not, we'll go on and I will quickly show you, if I can, I will quickly show you what that looks like. So again, I just, going back to what we just created, I simply have a form field and then a template variable. So as I update this, it automatically updates in real time. Again, it's got that two-way binding going on. So I didn't have to do anything to create that two-way binding other than say ng model equals this. And that's very, very cool and very powerful. And you can do that on an entire object level. You don't have to do it on a per variable level. So I could say, I could actually set a hash, or in Perl terms a hash, in JavaScript terms an object, to that field, and I could update that whole object and keep those in sync. So and we're going to get into more complicated versions of that in a bit. So any questions so far on that? Because if you don't get this part of it, then you're not going to get the rest of the talk. So it's very important that we get this through. Everybody's good? Okay. So everything else that we're going to talk about tonight builds on that very simple concept. Okay? Two-way binding of the model between the controller and the view. Okay? All right. So you can do the same thing with methods that I did with the variable there. So I can create a method called nameFormatted, again, I'm just putting, I'm just assigning a function there in JavaScript terms to the nameFormatted variable. So it's the same thing as a subref in Perl. And in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to return the first character as uppercase of the string, and the rest of it will be whatever it was. Okay? So unfortunately, JavaScript does not have a nice UC first subroutine like Perl does. So I have to make it, and it's that all ugly stuff there. So anyway, so that's this equivalent to UC first. Okay? So again, uppercasing the first letter, no big deal there. So in here, I'm going to update, this is the exact same view that we had before, but I'm going to update it with the subroutine now. So rather than calling name in the template variable, I'm actually going to execute the subroutine here. And so let's go take a look at that quick. And all of these files, by the way, are going to be out on madmongers.org so that you can play around with them yourself. So anyway, you know, that looks good, right? But if I lowercase Steve, it's still uppercase Steve, right? All right? Yes.
It's, I think, important to mention that Angular is smart enough to only call the function when the model changes.
That's correct. Yes.
So.
Yeah, it's not constantly calling this stuff in a loop. There's this mechanism inside of Angular called a digest that is keeping track of the state of the model. And so when the model changes, the digest gets triggered, which is firing off a bunch of events called watch events, which you can create your own custom watch events. And those things will then trigger changes throughout the entire application. It's very, very cool. And tonight we're going to go through this. It'll take about an hour and a half to go through what we're going to go through, and we're really only scratching the surface. So it's absolutely amazing, the stuff we can do. Okay. So, moving on. There is a better way to do what I just did, and that is by using filters. So, in a filter, I could just, instead of writing all that code I just wrote, I could just put in pipe uppercase, and now I have a filter that is going to uppercase Steve instead of me doing it. Okay? So this is a pre-built filter that is built into Angular that we can just use. Okay? The problem is it's going to create Steve all uppercase, not Steve uppercase first and lowercase everything else. So it's not really what we want to do. But if it were, it would be awesome, because then we didn't have to write any code. We just pipe uppercase.
Yeah, but this gives you a chance to show us how to write a filter.
That's right. I can show you how to write a filter, and so let's do that. So this is my little filter. It's right down here. I'm attaching that to the controller there. So we have a UC first. We're going to call it UC first, so it's just like Perl's UC first. Again, it just passes in the same stuff that we were doing in our other subroutine. Filters, when you create them, must return a function. So you can't just, I couldn't just return the value here, because then it would be a static value. So it must return a function. And then again, I'm just passing in, we're passing in a value from the filter. So that's where whatever comes before the pipe will show up, is what's going to get passed into value here. And then we're going to use the same code we used before to filter it. So going back to our code here. Actually, I'll back up one. Oops. So we have our UC first filter, and then over here we have our UC first filter. Okay, that's the lineup with everything. Does that make sense? Yep. So we've created a filter, and now we can use it, and you get what's going to happen, right? I don't need to demo that. Okay. Move. So it's very simple, very straightforward. And the beauty of that is, of course, now that filter, rather than being tied to name, can be reused for anything that we want to do a UC first on. Okay? So we've created a reusable code segment there, which is always good, right? And it's slightly shorter, which is also good. Okay. Oh, I should also say that filters, when you define a filter against the module, the filter isn't tied to the controller. So if I had multiple controllers in that same module, I could use that filter anywhere in any of the views. And likewise, if I import that module into another module, now that filter becomes available to other modules as well. Okay.
Can you pass parameters to the filter?
Yes, you can. And I have a demonstration of that next, actually. So,
Is there any concept of exporting a
actually, I don't know if there is a concept of that. You have to, for filters, I think they're all imported. With everything else, you have to explicitly import it. You have to explicitly use it. But in the case of filters, I think they're global. I don't think you can turn them off if you load them. If you load that module and it contains it. So, okay. And in the case if you had a conflict, one would overwrite the other. So. Yeah, there's definitely no private. So you just want to keep that out in its own module and load it in ad hoc in that case. Okay. So let's talk about complex filters. So that was a very simple example, UC first. Sometimes you want to do something crazier. So let's say you're working in an app that already exists. It's using MySQL dates, and it's just exporting those raw through its web service, right? It's not formatting it to be like a JavaScript native date type or anything else for that matter. It's a MySQL specific date type. So you're just throwing that out through your web service. So how do we filter that? So we can build a little filter for that. I gotta stop here for a second and explain what this is. Note that there's a string called $filter that I'm passing in, and then in the function I have $filter. Okay. The string there is actually a hash key of kind of the global objects that Angular exports. There's this object tree of things that you can bring in to your various directives and filters and everything, kind of at will. And so when you do this syntax like this, you're saying, I want to import filter into my subroutine, and how you get it into your subroutine is by putting it in your list of parameters that's passed in. Okay, and that way you can control the order of the parameters that are being passed in. Okay, so we want a reference to the filter object, which you'll see why in a minute, and then we need to get the we need to get the value and the format string passed to the filter, and I'll show you that in the view. So we're going to have the value, the date, which is the raw date time string, and then we'll have a formatter string of how we want to format that. Those are the two things that are being passed in, which goes directly to your question, and then and we're going to need to do something with that. And in this case, what we want to do is we're going to, I didn't put a blob in there for that, but we're going to return nothing if it's not actually, if there's nothing there. Can you turn that off? Thanks. All right, we're going to return nothing if there's nothing there, and I'm going to wait. All right, good. We're going to return nothing if there's nothing there, and then we're going to get this to look like a JavaScript date, what we need to do is put a T between the date and the time, and put a Z at the end of the whole thing. Okay, and that'll make that look like it's a regular JavaScript date. So once we have a string that looks like a regular JavaScript date, now we can use the built-in date filter that comes with Angular, and that's why we needed to import $filter so that it gives us our. I'm sorry, am I in your way?
No, you're fine.
Okay. That's why we need to. Am I better this way? Sorry, I just don't know. Okay.
You were fine.
All right. So yeah, that's why we needed to bring in $filter, and we're going to specifically call the date filter on that. Again, it's just a hash key, and then we're going to instantiate it as a date and pass it in, and pass in the format, and now we're good to go. We created our own date time, MySQL date time filter. Does that make sense? Okay.
Just because my JavaScript syntax is a little fuzzy, so and I don't know anything about Angular before. So the syntax here is $filter is a thing that you can get from Angular.
Yep.
And you're passing in an argument, or you're calling it with in parentheses update saying give me the date function. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, so that's the equivalent, again, that's the equivalent of a Perl hash key, date. So there, imagine that there is a method, so there's filter is an object in Perl, essentially, right?
Right, so you're getting the date element of that. Or the date.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
And so that's a function, and so you're passing it something.
That's
Okay.
right, yep.
Got it, okay.
Okay, good. All right, and then let's take a look at how we would use that in our view. So that's this right here. Again, standard, the pipe and date time, except in this case, we're going to have a colon and then a string that we're going to pass into that filter as our variable of what we're doing. And you can pass in, there's lots of different, there's a whole array of formatting options, obviously, in the Angular date filter, so you can do all kinds of things. The short date is just going to give you a 6-character date, and I'll do a demonstration here. Let's Oop, not that one.
Maybe skip that one.
Yeah. Okay. So you got your MySQL date here. And you know, I can just change that to whatever, and it'll fill it in. If I were to, let's see here, bring up a little this, make it big enough so you guys can see it, and holy crap, did I make it too big? All right. So if I were to change this, I can change this to, you know, a string of something like %y would give me a year, or I could do medium date, something like that, and it'll give me a little bit longer version of this. So now it looks like that, and so on. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. What's that? Oh yeah, very fast. Okay, so going back over here. Any questions on filters? It's pretty straightforward. You got it? Okay. Yeah. So we had that. So moving on to directives, because again, directives are the real powerhouse. This is where you can really get to do some crazy cool stuff with Angular, like define your own tags that have, it's not just defining a tag, it's actually defining all the functions of that tag. So we could do something simple like create a bold tag, which isn't all that interesting, or we could do something complicated like create a tag that displays a credit card form and handles all of the validation of that credit card form and submitting it back to the server. You can have it all in one tag. So you can do some crazy stuff. But we're going to go with something simple to start with and just display an address. So remember I said before that I could pass in anything to a scope variable. So I'm going to pass in an object here that contains an address. We could have fetched this from Ajax, but for right now I just want to keep it simple. We're just creating this in JavaScript here. And then we have the name of the directive that we're creating, and there's a bunch of little things in here that they're kind of weird. There's all kinds of attributes that you can pass in. In this case, the restrict attribute tells it how is this going to function? How is this directive going to function? E means element, so that means that we're going to create a tag. If that were A, it would mean attribute, which means we could apply this to any existing tag. Does that make sense? It'd be a new attribute of an existing tag. But in this case, we're limiting it to be its own tag. You can pass in a bunch of different things to scope. In this case, what I'm doing is saying I'm going to pass in an address into this thing, and that address must have bidirectional read-write values back to into my whatever I'm going to display with this directive, and back out to the model from whatever controller is controlling this thing. Okay. If I were to set that as an @ symbol, it would, instead of going bidirectional, it would be unidirectional. So all the stuff from the controller would get imported into the directive, but nothing could get back out. Why would I do that on this? I'm only showing an address because in the future I might make this address thing a form instead of just displaying an address. So I'm setting it up to go bidirectional now, so I don't have to go back and change this later. Okay. Okay. And then a template URL. There's a bunch of different things here. You could just do template : and pass in a string of what the template looks like. You can also create a script tag with an ID of the URL of that thing. So I could create a script tag with an ID of address.html, and now it will load that template inline out of a script tag right in the same page, rather than going out to fetch it. Okay, but in this case, it's going to go out and fetch it. Let's take a look at that quick. This is the template that I've created. Special note here is something I haven't shown before: ngIf. There are a bunch of different special things. We talked about ng model and ng controller and things like that. There's a lot of ng attributes that you can apply to things. There are three kind of in this vein. There's ngIf, which, if this is true, it will be displayed. If it is not true, it will not exist in the DOM. Okay. If you want it to be existing in the DOM but not displayed, you'd use ngShow instead. It's either going to be displayed or not displayed, but it'll always be in the DOM. Okay, with ngShow. With ngIf, it's only in the DOM if it is displayed. That makes sense. And then there's also ngSwitch, which allows you to do a switch case kind of thing if you have lots of different things going on. I'm going to display this if under this circumstance, and this under that circumstance, and so on.
Like a case statement.
Like a case statement. Yep, it's switch case, right? So, okay. So everybody understand the template that we got going on here? Okay. I want to make a mental note quick that I did not fill in an address in that original controller that I showed you guys.
A country.
Or I'm sorry, a country. Yeah, I didn't fill in a country. So it's still going to have this empty space here and this BR tag because I don't have a conditional if, but it will still display it. Any kind of errors are basically silent. Nothing is ever, if that value doesn't exist, it just silently displays nothing. There's no error thrown. It's just important for you to know that there's not going to be an error thrown if that's not available. Okay. So this is how I would go ahead and use that then. We just have, again, we just have our ng app, ng controller, just like before. I've got my new show address tag. And I actually want to back up here for a second. Crap, went way too far. Okay. Note the directive name here. It says show address with an uppercase A. See that? Okay. So moving back over to here, and there, it's show dash address. This threw me for a long time. I was always trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and it turns out that Angular automatically changes this stuff. In variables, if you name something with an uppercase, camel case, it then puts it as a hyphen lowercase for the tag that it creates. So I was always searching through code that other people had created so I could learn how this stuff works, and I would be searching for something, and of course the key I was looking for didn't exist because it was formatted completely differently depending on what am I talking about. Is it a directive or is it the HTML tag? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Is there a reason they did that way?
I have no idea. I'm sure they had a reason for it.
I was thinking earlier
The tag names are case insensitive, aren't they?
equals and the at. Is there a reason for that? I mean, a lot of people complain about Perl and how interesting it is. They call it rocket term.
You mentioned it could be because it's case insensitive.
The tag names.
Tag names are case insensitive, so they, instead of using the camel case, they put the dash in so that.
That's as good a reason as I have. So,
Oh, it's
yeah.
his idea.
I don't. Oh, it's somebody else's. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I don't know why they made any of the decisions they made. I haven't read any of the blogs or anything on why they built anything the way they did. Just learning how to use it myself. I've been using it for about 2 months now and figured out all this stuff, and so I thought I'd share it.
That's
So
an important thing
could
to
you
know.
call your directive show dash lowercase address?
Yeah, I was
Or
wondering
that-
about that.
or
Could
that
I try to
trait?
defeat this?
You can't. I try to do that. It throws an error when you try to do
Okay,
that.
so you have to write it to one way.
Because
and it
that's
has
not
to-
a valid JavaScript variable.
Because that has a dash in it, right? Right. So you have to basically write it in camel case for legibility, and then it has to convert it.
Right. So.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, we've got our custom tag there, our show address tag. So everybody's clear on that. We've covered that, and then we're assigning the address. So the right-hand side here is the address as it exists in the model in our scope variable. The left-hand side is what we are going to call it when it goes into our directive. All right. So in this case, they happen to be the same thing, but they don't have to be the same.
So you get like home address or business address or
Right.
second home address.
Exactly. Yep.
Up north address.
And so I guess let's take a look at what that looks like. So pretty simple. It's just displaying this. Not much to see here, but it's important that you see this because the next thing is where it gets interesting. So I'm not going to make a form. That's simple enough. This is cooler. So we need to talk about Ajax. I've been kind of avoiding it to this point because it makes everything shorter to not using it. But obviously, this isn't powerful if it doesn't, call back to a server at some point. So anyway, calling to a server, turns out it is very, very simple to do that. But we need to import a new variable that we didn't have access to before, which is HTTP. This is yet another one of those special variables. I told you that there's lots of them. So we're going to import the HTTP variable, and that will allow us to do Ajax requests. I should note that you'll note here there's no. I'm not calling it inside of a string or anything like that. Before I had filter inside of a string inside of an array reference. If you're using only variables that Angular exports, it will actually do some sort of black magic and read what's in there, and so you don't actually have to do it twice. So it'll just read
Okay.
that scope. You know,
It looks
I'm
like a
asking for
function.
I'm asking for scope and HTTP, so it's going to automatically do that other wrapper part for me.
How does it cope with minification?
It copes perfectly with minification. It's designed to be minified.
So even though, it's it
Well,
parsing the source though to find what you're looking for?
Yeah, apparently.
It can access the function definition. That's actually a string in the DOM
Okay.
that it can look at. And as long as your minifier doesn't change those two names, it should be fine. Most minifiers won't change that because it's
Too easy to break stuff.
too easy to break.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I minify my code and it works fine. So,
That might be a reason for the dollar signs in there then, to tell the minifiers
That could
not
be.
to touch those.
The minifier won't
could
break
be.
it because of the dollar sign.
yeah, could be. Okay, so moving on. I've imported that. We're going to create a new scope method, and I don't have to do this. I could just call the Ajax right now, right when the page loads. But I think it was more interesting as an example to call it when somebody pushes a button. That way you can see that it's asynchronous and that you could trigger it via anything. So I'm putting it inside of its own subroutine here, and we're going to fetch a file called address.json in the same folder as this stuff. You could put in a full URL there, and then we're going to process the result of that, assuming success, and I'll get into what happens in errors and that sort of stuff later. So it's very, very straightforward and easy. And then we're just going to assign that data to our scope variable, and note that it automatically is converting it from JSON into a native JavaScript object here. I didn't do anything. So very straightforward. Okay, so this is what our view is going to look like. We're going to have a button up here, and I'm introducing a new ng here for you. It's ng click. So if this element is clicked on, then we are going to execute said function, and we can pass stuff into that function if we want. But in this case, I don't need to. And again, we're using ng if. So if there is no address yet, because nobody has hit the button, then I don't want to display a template that's empty. So I don't want the extra BRs and commas and all the other stuff that was in the template to be displayed unless I actually have an address to display. So that's that. So with that, I will do a little demo if you guys want. Oops. Helps if I change the number here. I should have linked these all together. Oh, what? All right, so we got our button. We hit fetch. It goes out, does it. No big deal, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay. All did all that. Okay. So, moving on. There are a number of methods that are available via the HTTP object. The standard ones get, post, put, delete. Note that they do have different method signatures. If you want to pass parameters into get or delete, those are actually, there's a params element on the config to pass those in. You can't do it, you know, it's not a three method or a three variable thing. I get why they went that route, but it sucks. Because often
You
you're
have to
passing
put the params in config in order to get them to go.
Yeah, you have to pass in, so config is an object, and in the object you'll have a params element that will have an array of parameters, or another object of parameters that you want to pass.
Those will go on the URI.
They're going to end up getting,
Rather-
attached to the URI.
Okay.
So you
params
could,
is what gets posted.
yeah, you could simply put all those params right in the URI in those cases, because that's kind of how get and delete are supposed to work anyway. But since they provide a mechanism for passing them in, you might as well make it a three-method signature, or a three-parameter signature as far as I'm concerned. There are other things also. So there's head and patch and a bunch of other methods that are available. These are just the common ones that most people are going to use, so that's why I put them in here. Read the Angular documentation if you want to get the complete list of them. Each of these, no matter which one you're calling, is going to return a promise. And promises are something that is very, very cool, but not something I really want to get into for the purposes of this discussion, because it could be an entire talk all by itself. But for people who are familiar with it, promises are a multitasking interface that kind of, they work a lot better than any event, but they're basically like any event in Perl. They're basically a callback system. And they're very, very cool, but again, that could be a whole topic all by itself. And there is an implementation of promises in Perl these days, which is very cool. And I'm hoping it replaces any event as kind of the dominant form of callbacks in Perl. So each of these returns a promise, and these specific promises have these methods on them. All promises have a then method, but these specific promises also have success and error. And success and error are allow you to pass in a function, and it'll give you those different parameters. And the cool thing is that data will be automatically turned from JSON into a native JavaScript object for you if you use success or error. Not so if you use then. Then is the default thing on the promise, so it doesn't know that you made an HTTP request. Okay, it's just saying then something happens, and the two things are going to be a success or failure. Okay, it then always takes two subroutines, success or failure. So you're going to have to do some special processing if you use then, but you can do some funky stuff that you can't get away with in success and error. In your case, 99.99% of the time, you're going to use success and error. Okay? All right. Any questions? Okay. I already did a demo of fetching the address. So we'll move on to creating services. I said at the beginning of this, services and factories are kind of two sides of the same coin. And this is where your application logic is going to go. The majority of your application logic is going to go into here. Especially anything you want to be reusable across multiple Angular apps. So in my case, I've got all kinds of different objects and modules that I've created as services and factories. I've got stuff for handling credit card processing, address manipulation, logins, proofing images through the game crafter, all that kind of stuff. I've got tons and tons of these objects all over the place. Wing, which we've talked about here before, is entirely wrapped in a set of these objects of factories, so that you can do all of your AJAX processing through there. Again, all your authentication and permissions checking and all that kind of stuff, all done through Angular using services and factories. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go into what are these things. So I want to define a new service. I'm going to call it a color service so that I can use it. Let me back up a second. Let me talk about services versus factories. Services are singletons. Factories need to be instantiated. Okay? So you're going to call new on a factory. You're not going to call it on a service. A service is an object, but it is already pre-instantiated for you. For that reason, because they're singletons, services are kind of, you're going to use those if you want to communicate between multiple directives or multiple controllers, because it's a global, essentially. It's a singleton that you can access from all these different things. So if you need to share information, you're going to use a service. A factory is is where you're going to write most of your code, because you're going to need to instantiate it. So for every employee that you have, you'll have a factory that generates employees, that sort of thing. Okay, so anyway, we're going to define a new service called the color service. I want to share this between an editor and a viewer. We're going to import the color service into our editor controller, and then we're going to create a subroutine that is going to allow us to set the color in that service. Okay, and then in the viewer controller, we're going to import the color service again, so that we can now share that data between these two controllers. And the reason that you might do this is if you have a complex editor and a complex viewer, in the editing process, you might want to have the viewer and the editor on the same page so that you can have real-time, what does this thing look like that I'm editing? But when you're actually displaying it out to the public, the editor won't be on that page. So it needs to be in its own controller so that you can share that code. On the editor page, I have the editor and the viewer, but on the public part of the page, I only have the viewer, right? So they need to be two separate controllers. But we still need to be able to share this information. So we're, that shouldn't say creating directives at the top. Sorry about that. So in this case, we have our editor controller. We're going to bind to this section. And we have the viewer controller that we're going to bind down here. We have a bunch of buttons that are going to call set color and on ng click, and they'll pass in the color that we want to set. And then down here, we're going to make use of the color by using a template variable inside of a style tag, right? You can also do lots of cool class manipulation and stuff, but this is simpler for the purposes of this tutorial. So does that all make sense? Okay, let's take a look. All right, so by default, I set it to be blue, but as I click on these, I can change the color. And so down here is my view, up here is my editor, two different controllers on the same page, sharing information through a service. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? Any questions? Okay. You guys are picking up on this easier than I thought.
It's fun.
Okay. I should mention that the documentation for Angular is quite obtuse. It is it's clearly written by the people that wrote Angular. It is clearly written by people who already know how everything works. It works good for reference. It is terrible for learning. If you're trying to learn Angular, go to Stack Overflow, or there are a number of YouTube channels that specialize in making videos about Angular. Anywhere but the Angular documentation is where you want to be to learn how to use Angular. So
So you're saying there's a need out there?
yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay.
Have you written a book about it yet?
I don't need to because lots of other people have.
Well,
So-
that's what I'm saying. So
There are Angular books there, and like I said, there's lots of YouTube videos and blogs and things like that. And a lot of Stack Overflow help me, I'm lost, kinds of things that will help you navigate this.
So a good Tumblr series might be in order?
There are a number of them, but yes, I mean you could always have more for sure.
So something along the lines of, I'm learning Angular, would you like to follow my
Yeah.
my journey?
Yes. Okay. So factories. Factories work basically the same way, except again, you're instantiating new copies of the object every time. So you're returning a subroutine here, whereas in the service we returned nothing because we were just using the object that was already there. So in a factory, we are returning a subroutine or a function. And that function will be the new instance of the object that we want to manipulate. So we have this, and we're gonna, based on the args that are passed in the constructor, we're defining the constructor with our function here. So the args that are passed into the constructor, we're going to assign those to some of the variables in here. Again, we could add methods and anything else. This is, JavaScript object creation 101 type stuff. So there's lots of stuff that you can do there. Get into prototypes and all the other things that JavaScript objects can, but I don't want to cover that for tonight. Just throwing it out there that this is just a standard JavaScript object. Okay, so I've defined a factory called person, and that person has two attributes, name and ID, and no methods at this point. And of course, Okay, so then I also am going to create a controller that will again import the person factory. Yes, it's the human
Because
controller.
we all need to be controlled.
Well, apparently just me and Sean.
Yeah. And Sean's not even here, damn it. All right. So yeah, I'm going to instantiate two new people and push them onto the people array. So this is again very standard JavaScript 101 type stuff. I just need to create my array of data. And so we're importing our factory. We set our default employee number here. If we didn't do this, I'm going to create a select list. I'm going to show you how to create a select list using Angular. And if I didn't do this, the select list would default to empty. It would create a new element, empty, and then display my two objects. But I want it to default to Sean as the employee, so I'm setting that, defaulting that to number 2, and then again adding a person object for each employee. Okay. This is what our template is going to look like for our view. So again, we've got app madmongers, we got our controller, and then we've got our select. And there are a bunch of different ways to create select lists in Angular. This is probably the more flexible one, but it's not. There are much shorter ways to create select lists. So with this, you just create a select element and you give it the model, and that's how it's going to know what to set it to by default, or what you're updating in the model. And then you have an option, and let's walk through this one by one here. ng repeat. This is a new one that I didn't show you guys yet. This is iterating over a list of things, and there's lots of cool stuff that you can do with repeat. It's almost as flexible as SQL with all the different things that you can pass in here. So you can, there are lots of other keywords that you can put in there besides in, like as and for and there's a bunch of stuff suffixes that you can add too. Anyway, there's a lot of different things you can do with ng repeat. I usually look them up because there's so many that whenever I'm trying to do something, I just need to look it up. Anyway, but just know that you're iterating over a list, and that list is going to be the element. It is going to, for each element in that list, it's going to repeat the tag that this is assigned to. So ng repeat is in the option tag, therefore there will be an option tag for every person in people. Does that make sense? Okay.
And people comes from human control, the controller.
That's right. People comes from
person then is the name that you're going to use in your value and in your template, your other template variables.
I'm defining person here. Person didn't exist before. People existed in the scope of the controller, and then I'm going to assign. So I have the person object, which is, I'm just pulling off one thing off the list of people, and I'm going to assign the ID of that person as the value. Again, just a template tag here. And then over here, it starts up at the top, but there's ng selected. This is specifically for options, again, in a select list. This is just how I say whether this gets selected equals 1 in HTML terms. So if...
That's sort of like an extended version of the normal selected property. ng decides whether the selected property is going to be on based on that test.
Exactly. Yep, you can put all kinds of things in here. So you can have ors and ands and all that. You can call a subroutine on here to determine whether or not it's true, whatever. But if it returns a true value, then this will be selected. It'll have selected equals 1 appended as an attribute. If it is not true, then it will not have that. Okay.
SQL where clause.
So,
What's that?
Like the SQL where clause.
yeah.
Mhm.
Does it
I think-
do order by and group by? Or?
There's all kinds of stuff you can do in here. Yeah. So.
Then you can apply CSS to figure out how it's going to display the selection.
Yes, you can. Yeah. Yeah, you can get some pretty crazy stuff going on here. We're only barely scratching the surface.
I think the neatest part about that is that in order to repeat the option, you're actually assigning it a property that tells AngularJS to, expand it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like wrap it in a loop or something. You're
Yep.
you're assigning it.
Yeah, that's one of the
That's
real
neat.
powerful things about Angular.
That's pretty cool.
All right. And then, of course, we got another template tag for the name. We want to put that in the select list, so that's the human readable part of the select list. And then, just for giggles, I'm also going to display which employee ID down here so that you can see that it's actually adjusting the model when we do that. So that's pretty straightforward. And let's see here. Okay, so we have our select list here. and you can see that Sean is indeed selected first. Who is selected is 2. If I change that to Steve, then it would, change. And if I added a little button here that would add a new element to that list, it would automatically change the list here so that it would add those new elements in there dynamically. No, I don't have to go back and update this list. It'll automatically update itself because the digest changed. So, pretty straightforward. Cool.
Wow.
It's very powerful. Yeah. I told you it's going to change your life. All right. All right. So that's it for the basic stuff. We've already taken up over an hour just talking about the basic stuff. And again, I've only scratched the surface here. We could do another couple of talks on individual. I could do a whole talk on just ng repeat because there's so much stuff you can do with just that. Anyway, all kinds of stuff. But I thought before we call it done, I would give you a few tips that I struggled with as I was doing my first few Angular apps, because it will save you hours of frustration and searching the internet for why the hell does this not work like I think it should. Okay. First tip. Passing credentials. So Angular prides itself on being a pretty damn secure system. They try, everything is locked down by default. I should have put another pro tip in here along that lines. You cannot, if you have HTML in a scope variable, it will display the HTML string. It will not render the HTML. Okay, that's right out of the gate. That's how it works. You actually have to load a completely separate script in and use a whole bunch of additional ng tags to display HTML if you have HTML inside of a variable and you want to display it. Okay,
That's a good thing.
it is a good thing because it's going to prevent a whole series of cross-site scripting type attacks. All right. The same is true with credentials. Even though you may already be logged into the site, you already have passed it some HTTP auth stuff, or you have a cookie assigned that gives you credentials to be able to call these web services. If you do not set this to true, Angular by default has no access to those things. It will not send them when you make a request to the server. So you will be making an unauthenticated request to the server. Any AJAX request that you make will be unauthenticated if you have not set this. And note, we're looking at another thing here, config. It's a whole other type of service that is available so that you can override a whole bunch of internal defaults. Again, just barely scratching the surface of what Angular does. But just know that everything is secure by default. So if you're doing anything that is even remotely has the remote possibility of being exploited, it will not work by default. You will have to find a trigger like this that will enable that feature somehow, either through loading an external script or enabling some config setting or whatever. So this is the big one, though, that most people struggle with right off the bat. Even though you're already authenticated to the site through your browser, Angular is not authenticated until you flip that bit to true. Okay?
So does that mean if you flip that, it's going to send it to all of them, or is
Yes.
HTTP? Okay.
Yes. And you can do it on per request through the config. Remember that one of the parameters that
That's the
you...
config thing.
Yes.
Okay. So you could put this in that config thing and say this one needs to be authenticated,
That's right.
instead of making it global, which is what this does.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. In,
Good.
It's still JavaScript, right?
It's still JavaScript.
So can I just change the behavior of any function that I want inside of Angular by overriding it?
Can you change the behavior of any...
If I want to change how with credentials or defaults works, I can just do that. 'Cause it's JavaScript.
That's what I'm doing.
Right.
So I don't know what you're asking.
You're
Oh.
saying like in the console or something.
Right. I just wonder how Google would say anything is secure inside of JavaScript.
As secure as it can be.
Yeah.
It just does not want to assume that it should have, your app should have access to the credentials.
The back end won't.
So,
send-
okay. So was there another question, or did you?
No, you answered my question, which was, is there a way to do it on a per request.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, anyway, all the stuff that I'm doing is all authenticated all the time, so it's easier to put it into a global like this than it is to pass it on a per request basis. But if you should need to do it on a per request basis, that's what the third parameter is in post and put, and the second parameter in get and delete is for.
I realize this makes it more tempting to rewrite bad sites.
What's that?
This makes it more tempting to rewrite bad sites.
Yeah. Isn't that a good thing?
There's so many of them out there.
Yes, there are.
I'm good, thanks.
I just spent the last, so I got into this about a year and a half ago. I wrote my first Angular app. I didn't really get what I was doing. Even when I was done, I didn't understand how it worked. Then I wrote another one about 6 months ago, and I started seeing the power of what it could do, and it was like a light switch turned on, and it was like, whoa. And at that point, I made the decision that at some point I was going to rewrite all of my sites using Angular, starting with the flagship one, which is the Game Crafter. And 2 months ago, I started down that path. I was just going to rewrite this one little section of the site because we needed some new features. We needed some new features, so I was just going to go in and just tweak just that one little piece there. I ended up
the pager went off for me.
might have, yeah, and then I did that, and it worked so well that I decided, you know what, all of Wing needs to have this. So I went through and redid all of Wing to do this, and then I'm like, well, now that Wing does it, maybe all of the Game Crafter should do this. And so I'm not quite done with everything in the Game Crafter, but I have done 70% of the Game Crafter in 2 months, rewrote everything using this. So, so yeah. Okay. What's that?
Did you watch Beyond Shark Tank the other night?
No, I didn't know there was a show called Beyond Shark Tank.
Oh, well, Mark Cuban was talking to one of the companies he was involved with, and they wanted to redo the website to be a little bit more fancier here and there. And he basically, they didn't get into geek speak what they wanted to do, but he slammed the door shut.
Yeah. Well, with my business hat on, there was no reason to rewrite those things that I did, but it's so much nicer. And so much less code, too, for that matter. So
along those lines, like I haven't written like sites that are like dominated by JavaScript and stuff. I've done as like portions of my site.
Okay.
So like, is it possible to sort of break out and say, oh, I'm just going to work on this one section? Is that easy, or is it compartmentalized?
Oh yeah, it's totally easy to do because you basically you can write an Angular app per page if you want to, and therefore so only this one page is Angularized, and the rest of it is still the old stuff, whatever you were using before.
Right. Like I have some bunch of stuff that has like a lot of prototype stuff in it. I don't know if they break or there's namespace collisions or anything like that. I guess if you.
Yeah, I don't know how it would work with prototypes. I can't imagine there would be that there would be a namespace collision with prototype.
I'm just thinking out loud.
It is actually designed to work with jQuery, so it actually has its own jQuery Lite like module in it for DOM manipulation. If you don't have jQuery loaded, it will use its own. I think it calls it Angular JQ or something like that. Anyway, I always have jQuery loaded anyway. So then when you do, it will take full advantage of jQuery. As far as prototype or Moo or any of those other ones, they're all designed to be namespace so that you don't have collisions. So I don't think you'd have a collision, but it's not gonna take advantage of the DOM manipulation in any of those.
Yeah, that's the problem I run into when I start playing with something new, is it breaks everything else.
Yeah, I don't think that you'll have that problem with this. So
Where's an instance where I guess it makes sense to use jQuery to do the DOM manipulation, where it's not at odds with how Angular does its templating and everything?
Often it's not. Often you will use jQuery less and less as you go. However, if you're using a bunch of jQuery plugins that require jQuery to be there, you're going to continue to need to have jQuery. Also, jQuery is useful for its animate function and some of the other things that are not DOM manipulation that Angular isn't there to do at this point. So, yeah. I'll just give you a big example of this. I use Bootstrap for. Does everybody know what Bootstrap is? No. Okay. So Bootstrap is a display library, a templating library for your website to make your website all fancy and cool and basically dynamic. So it will scale based on the size of the browser window that you're looking at. So it'll look this way on a phone, and it'll look this way on a tablet, and it'll look this way on a full screen device. That's its kind of bread and butter, but it also has all kinds of nice fancy things for displaying icons and handling tooltips and modal dialogues and all kinds of crazy stuff. There is a project called Angular UI, which will convert things like Bootstrap into Angular-friendly things. And so all of the stuff that is inside of Bootstrap, it's written in jQuery. All the stuff is written in jQuery inside Bootstrap. But in Angular UI, it will convert all of those jQuery things into Angular type things so that you can very nicely tie it in. And instead of having all this JavaScript all over the place that you would normally have, you just insert a tag. This is my modal tag, and now I have a modal dialog and all this functionality that's attached to that. I want a paginator, and so now I just put one tag, pagination tag, and it does all the stuff that you would normally have to put into all those other things. Anyway, digression. Moving on. Another thing, this is not specifically Angular, a problem with Angular, it's a problem with IE. Lots of versions of IE will cache AJAX stuff even if the server tells it not to cache those things. So even if you have the proper cache headers, IE will still cache it. So if a user comes to your site and creates an item in a list, for example, and then they come back to that page, the list will look how it looked when they first came to the page, even though they have added a new thing, because IE will not go fetch the new data set when you call to fetch data set again. It will cache that. So you actually have to, I ran into this when I redid all of the Game Crafter. I ran into this once before. jQuery actually has a thing built into it. There's a global setting you can turn on that's for fixing this problem. And all it does is it adds a random string to the end of every URL that's fetched. So that way IE won't cache the stuff. In this case, we're actually going to manipulate the headers of the result when it comes back to tell IE that it's old. So we're not adding the string to the server, we're adding the string, or on the fetch, we're telling IE that this thing is new no matter what. And so that's what this is. We're injecting, we're using another global HTTP provider default. We're injecting if modified since, setting it to 1997. And then there are certain versions of IE that you also have to do this other incantation down below for, setting cache control and pragmas and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, this is normal stuff that you would normally set at the server side of how you want things to be set up. But you have to actually override it in some cases to make IE work correctly.
I think you just solved the problem.
I'm glad to help.
You'll get the bill.
You're just
Yep.
going to have to convert everything to Angular.
So,
I wish.
Yeah, but you could presumably do the same thing in jQuery, yes.
you could. jQuery
but
solves it a
already
different way.
does it.
Yeah, jQuery solves it a different way. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I can. If somebody really wants the jQuery incantation, I can give it to you. It's a one-liner that you put at the beginning of your script. Anyway, I had forgotten that I solved this so many years ago in jQuery, and then I did this, and oh, this is still a problem in IE. Damn it. So that fixes that. So you can actually intercept the request cycle also. So you can get some real power going on here. For example, just as a very simple case, let's say you want to display a little throbber. When you make the request, it starts spinning, and when the request comes back, regardless if it's a success or fail, it stops spinning. Okay? So that's it. You can intercept all of the requests that are going. You'll always display the throbber, and then you'll always turn the throbber back off when it comes back. You can do much fancier stuff with this. For example, Wing just throws back all kinds of different things like warnings and errors and whatever, and we have a display mechanism for displaying all those, how they're formatted and all this other stuff. So rather than having to deal with an error response on every single method call, I have an interceptor that if an error comes back or a warning comes back, it just automatically handles that stuff for me, so that I'm not having to define it on every single call, every single service request. I define it globally, and then I can still do other stuff with it, but I also get this. Anyway, so I also have this throbber thing in there, because it's often nice. A user wants to know that some requests are going on, and if you don't display something to them, they will not know that requests are going on. So anyway. Okay. If you end up creating a bunch of useful utilities for yourself, and you will, you should throw them into a module or a series of modules and make them so that they are easily loadable for your applications, because that way you will have a nice little toolkit that you're building for yourself that you can reuse on different pages with your different filters and your different directives and things of that nature. And you throw them into a module. So in this case, I'm creating a My Stuff module. You can call it whatever you want. It's good to use better names than My Stuff. You'll want to use something that won't have namespace conflicts, is a good thing. So you'll want to probably put your company name somewhere in there, for example, so that if you happen to load a module from somebody else somewhere, you're not going to get some kind of collision. And then you can use that module. And then all those things become available to you to be imported into your directives and controllers and whatnot. So,
does that name have any purpose besides those two spots?
Nope, it's just for linking the two things together.
So really, like some random ID would work just fine.
A random ID would work just fine, except that you wouldn't be able to know what the hell it was.
Right, you just go and look at your include script, grab it, then plug it in there. And
or you could use something that's human readable so that other people can.
That's silly. Humans need control.
Yes, that's why I built the human controller. Okay. Okay. So here's an example. Here's an example of something that you might do with a directive that isn't for the purposes of creating some new functionality on your site. You might need to do this just because you're integrating with an old app. For example, your old app might be Perl, and it might be a brand new app. Perl, you may not know this, if you're using a hash key, the hash key is always a string in Perl. So even if it's a number, even if it's a numeric value, it'll come back as a string in JSON. Okay? If you were to put that string into a number field in the HTML, if you called the input type equals number, Angular will throw an error because you tried to put a string value into a numeric field. Okay? Here's something else that's interesting. I don't know if this is in the DBI driver or where this is coming from exactly, or if it's in the MySQL DBI driver, or if it's in MySQL itself. But if you set a default value that is an integer, like let's say I want an integer of 10, when I return that back to the server, it will, or back up to the client, it will be the integer 10. But when I fetch that back out of the database and return it to it later, it will be a string 10, unless I have multiplied or subtracted or whatever off of it to turn it back, to cast it back into an integer. It will be a string. And so it'll come across from JSON, or to JSON as a string. Now, Perl internally handles this very nicely. If I decided I wanted to multiply on a number that was a string, it'll just cast it as a string, as a number for me, and no big deal. JavaScript will not do that. JavaScript is very particular about using parseInt or parsefloat or number or any of those kinds of things to convert between strings and integers. And Angular is very particular about it as well. So you might find yourself in a situation where you need to be able to use a number field, but Angular is going to puke at you unless you do a bunch of fancy stuff. So instead of doing fancy stuff on every request, you could just rewrite the input number tag, the default one that's built into the browser. Literally change it, replace it with your own. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm going, if this is an input tag, then I want to run this directive. If this input tag is of type number, then we'll continue on, otherwise we'll just let it do its own little thing. And we're going to get the model value and convert that to a number, and if we're going to get the view value and convert that to a number. So we're just going to numberify whatever it is, assuming that whatever we got from the server was supposed to be a number, regardless of what JSON cast it as. Okay? And so that way, it is actually a number as you intended it to be, because you could put it into a number field. I'm going to assume you meant it to be a number. And it will be a number field, and now nobody will throw any errors at you, and you will be able to run all of your calculations off of this field, you know, as a number, not as a string. So if you plus something to it, instead of concatenating, it will actually plus 1 or whatever. So I just rewrote the input number field using Angular.
You Perlified your JavaScript.
That's correct. And so that is the power of Angular. It's not just so that I can add functionality to the browser, it is so that I can bend the browser to my will. And I do it in a way that works across all the browsers. So it doesn't matter whether this is IE or Chrome or Firefox or Safari, it works in all of them.
Should be safe too, because it's only going to do it if you want it to be a number.
That's right. So, anyway, that is how I'm going to leave you. At this point, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we are done, and thanks for coming.
Wow.
Nice how you pulled the little